Everybody, thank you for joining us. Almost done with the conference. It's nice to be, third to last? So you have the whole conference to worry about it. So my name is Brian, and this is Lillian. And we're going to talk to you today in kind of a little different way. So this will be part almost like an ethnographic interview, part almost two different talks at once, part talking about diversity, and mostly us talking as a discussion group. Because the one thing I've learned when it comes to doing diversity in tech talks is that it's really easy for someone to stand in front of you and kind of tell you what diversity ought or should be, and for you to walk away saying, well, that was a really interesting idea that that person had. But I found that as we discuss it, it forces all of us to take ownership of this issue, this very important cultural issue. And if we actually want to affect real change, the first thing we need to do is actually take ownership of the issue. So I hope you'll join us through this. So it's a quick schedule. The time is totally arbitrary. It's just what I thought we might do. So we'll start with some introductions of the two of us. We'll kind of talk about our origin stories, how both Lillian started the collective and how I ended up being a part of it. We'll talk a little bit about the collective itself. It's called Hypatia. We'll talk about some challenges that we've had in doing it over the past 6 months. Something that's really important to me as an anthropologist who studies this group is the question, why not just join a feminist hackerspace? Which almost is like the first question that you get when you talk about these things. And I want to wrap it up a little bit by talking about a particular theoretical framework that I use to think about this that I call generative justice, and how generative justice is actually really interesting to think both of free software and then also how these trans women apply that to their collective. And then we're going to talk a whole lot about it. All right, so Lillian, you can start introducing yourself.
Okay. I'm currently an engineer at Lead Pages in Minnesota. It's a startup. I started Hypatia Software Organization a while back. It's not too old, just this year. I have a lot of open source projects that actually led to the creation of the organization. So I've been doing open source stuff for a while too. Yeah, I think those are some useful tidbits.
So I'm Brian, as I introduced myself before. I'm a doctoral student at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. It's in Troy, New York, right next door to Albany. I'm in what's called the Department of Science and Technology Studies, which when you say, people say, you do what now? You do science and tech? Well, yes. So science and technology studies, to kind of make a really broad statement about it, it's a collection, interdisciplinary collection of anthropologists, sociologists, historians, and philosophers of science who are interested in these kinds of questions around science technology policy, and the like. I've been doing open source, free software for a long, long time, about 10 years now, actually longer. I've been involved in the BSD Unix scene. I am/been an OpenBSD developer. I often tell people the important thing of ex-OpenBSD developer is the hyphen, because people actually usually get really obsessed with, oh, you're BSD, so you must know all about this security stuff, especially with OpenBSD and its ties to OpenSSH. Or they see the X part and say, oh, well, tell us all the crazy stories of what it was like to be an OpenBSD developer. But both are important, so the hyphen is the important part of that phrase. And then why don't we introduce what Hypatia is to everybody?
Oh, so the organization is this framework for one of our key goals that we measure is our ability to find an impoverished transgender woman and get her a job in software engineering as fast as we can, ideally. A part of that process is relying on volunteers from the community who are often role models, other transgender women who are employed in software engineering, as mentors to do one-on-one sessions with the beneficiaries, the transgender women. And we have a lot of a lot of the organization is based around the idea of a community, and that's kind of where we sprouted out from, and that's kind of how we maintain ourselves, is that it's solidarity, but it's also allies coming together all under one purpose, but it's community in a much greater sense than just coming together for a single purpose as well. Like, everyone knows each other's name, and everyone seems to care deeply about each other. And I think that plays a pretty big role in what we do, and we'll get more into that.
All right, so I have a question, or several questions for you, actually. So if we take that broad story of what Hypatia is, because I know watching us on the live stream today are some of the people in our organization, and maybe even some trans women who are not yet part of our organization. So how would you describe this, talking to one of those trans women who are not yet part of our organization but want to be?
Typically, when we do outreach programs, we're looking for people in low income brackets, transgender women who are often reluctant sex workers. And it's provided, I typically advertise it as a community and a network of support that will probably end up getting you a job, and that everyone is there to care for each other, because one of the biggest obstacles that a lot of these transgender women face is the fact that they're isolated and they're ostracized, and it can be really hard to overcome these obstacles when you're all alone and people are completely unsympathetic about those issues. And if somebody steps in and says, we know about your issues and we identify your issues, and we're particularly there to help you, it makes a world of difference. And that's when you start seeing like generic diversity initiatives having lower conversions to more specific ones like this, which have higher ones, because you're specifically addressing those issues.
So I guess relatedly, so if that's how you'd explain it to trans women, you kind of gave the broad overview before. You know, ultimately, like any group, for better or for worse, we need money to keep going. So kind of how would you explain what Hypatia is to someone who may have money, who may be interested in either donating to us, being a patron for us? So how would you explain Hypatia to them?
A large factor of our organization is to be a source of professional recommendations and connections that we can actually hand off to these people we're promising jobs, is to be a professional entity ourselves. Initially, we were considering going the route of a nonprofit, but we're currently analyzing going a B corporation for that very purpose. We need to be self-sustaining, and we need to have the sort of professional reputation that would come along with companies doing referral programs with us, or just us being extremely useful as a resume, reference, or recommendation, those sort of things.
So we'll move on to our origin stories. And just, because I forgot to mention at the beginning, if anyone has questions at any time, just raise your hand, we'll toss you the mic. This should very much be a dialogue. Again, I think part of the way that we own this very important social issue is by talking about it, by doing something about it. And that's one way of getting started into that. Right. So you want to give your origin story?
So
we have a question, sorry.
Oh.
I think you need the mic so they can get on the recording.
Right, we want to make sure people can hear it. For somebody who may be in a low income bracket who's interested in getting involved with Hypatia, is having a laptop basically a precondition? Or is that something, you know, if you're starting to talk with somebody who is in that situation, is that one of the major things that you're doing, is being like, kind of, here's a starting package of like, let's get you with regular internet access, with a laptop, with connections?
Recently, actually, one of our developers is that just came to us didn't have a laptop, and somebody else in the organization, without even consulting us, went ahead and bought them a device to develop on. So in a lot of these situations, like the community makes sure to take care and mend itself. So I haven't felt the need so far as to have an official program, because anytime I've seen somebody say that, like, I don't have a laptop and I'm at a library computer, that someone's instantly like, oh, let's take care of that. And I mean, we as an organization don't have much money, and a lot of what we do depends solely on people's willingness inside of the organization, and that's why curation of people is so important.
That's also why gaining external funders is also so important. You know, that's one isolated story. You know, that story will continue to repeat itself as Hypatia grows. So one of the very important reasons why we need to secure this outside funding. Right? So, origin story?
Oh, yeah. So this started off probably, well, it started off a while ago, and I'd been homeless once before, and then I'd ran into a job that was pretty awful and transphobic, and then I was homeless again, obviously. And one of the things that helped me establish a stable career path was I developed a game engine called Hypatia engine. And I connected to a few key people on Twitter, and it got retweeted a bunch, and it got really popular, and it attracted a lot of attention. Something that I noticed in particular is that a lot of women and transgender women were coming to me because of a lot of my outspoken opinions online. So it kind of sort of naturally, it naturally sprouted from there. It just gained more and more attention, and then we're like, wow, we actually have the power to change people's lives with this. And it wasn't such a complex model. It was just one-on-one mentoring with people in the organization. It's something that we'd been doing regularly to train in developers to catch up on what we were doing in the organization for open source software, like Hypatia engine itself. So I realized, especially after I started working at this place called Thinkful, and they do, it's just like, it's one-on-one mentoring. And one of the things that I noticed is how particularly, it's really effective when you can teach somebody and you're talking to them and it's just one-on-one. And what's especially effective is if that person, like aforementioned, knows where you're coming from and they know your trials. So it just proved to be a really effective model that we iterated over until it became Hypatia Software Organization, and now Hypatia Engines, just called Sappho, to not confuse people.
All right, and so for me, as a PhD student, one of the things we're told we must do is write that dissertation, get the PhD, get the doctorate. It turns out I'd already met Lillian before Hypatia really took off. And I met her because as an OpenBSD developer, one of my jobs was to do all the third-party packages that every Linux distro does. And it just so happened that I found Hypatia in its early form, and I thought it was really neat. So I wrote in the BSD land, we call them ports, but they're packages. So I wrote a port, submitted it, and it turns out that OpenBSD was the very first operating system to have Hypatia in its software repository out of every operating system. Fast forward a few months later, I lose my account from OpenBSD, kind of for having the gall to say, it's not cool that the BSDs are all white men and Japanese men, which is true. So I lose my account, and it turns out that I start getting all these messages from people saying, now that you're gone, OpenBSD will be a different place because you were the only developer who actually fought for us and treated us like people. And it turns out it was a lot of trans women who were telling me this. So it got me to realize that we actually have these minority coders on our periphery, and they're right there waiting to become part of our mainstream, if only we'll let them. And so it ends up talking to Lillian pretty much that day. I think it was almost that night that I had mentioned that we were chatting about something else. And she kindly invited me to hop onto her IRC channel, and that later turned into the Slack that we now use for Hypatia. And I realized this is something worth talking about. Like, this is something worth staking a career about. The minority coders in tech that no one else will talk about. So I've hung out with them ever since. I've had some published papers and looking forward to finishing the dissertation, getting my PhD, and being able to be more effective as a diversity in tech advocate. So this is one way that I've owned this societal problem that we have. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit of kind of like Hypatia as the structure, what we do, how we do it, what we do for the trans women. So you want to start off talking a little bit about our community?
Yeah. So I felt that the most important aspect, as we've talked about, was the community that everything else sprouts out from. Because the problem that we're trying to address is the difficulty for transgender women to be accepted for who they are among peers in a psychologically safe environment, which often turns out to be the most determining factor of productivity for engineers in terms of environment in general, is if your environment is one where someone's even afraid to bring up issues or is afraid to kind of challenge the group, you're going to get a less diverse set of ideas, meaning less conflict, meaning that there's less rigor that goes into your software products. Community also, it's about not just establishing solidarity among transgender women, but it's also about establishing normalcy among our cis allies and otherwise allies. So we can invite these people into our Slack channel and they can see what we're doing and they can see that it operates like most remote work or open source organizations do, and that everything's carried out pretty professionally, and that we're developing real software products and we're holding real meetings about architecture and so on and so forth. So that's a big part of it. So normalizing and solidarity.
And just to give you an idea of the scope of our community at the moment, so I've kind of been there from the beginning, and I think when our Slack channel first started, there were 5 of us, 6 of us, maybe. We're about to hit the 80 member mark, and I would say that's easily into the mid 70s of trans women who are there and want to do and learn free software and programming. And they see this as a way for economic development, for gender justice, for social justice for them. And I think that's pretty significant growth in what we're really talking about, a 5-6 month period, to go from 5 to almost 80 people. Thank you. And it's actually quite organic, in many ways mirrors exactly what we do with free software. You know, like Richard did in 1983, he wrote an email saying, or Usenet post saying, hey, I'm writing this thing. If you think you want to be a part of it, let me know. Lillian's been great at that. You know, going on Twitter saying, hey, I'm doing this thing for trans women. Are you a trans woman? Are you an ally? We want you. And people come. And I think that's really great. So you want to talk a little bit about kind of how we model and frame Hypatia, especially because one of our goals is, because we can't do everything and we can't serve everybody. One thing that this collective, for better or for worse, kind of struggles with is the racial intersection. And that just happens to be the makeup of how we got to be where we are. But we do think that we can come up with a model, or at least a framework, that others can replicate to achieve this kind of success through free software. So you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So the general framework is you need a community that's a safe space dominated by the people of that community, and you need role models who are of that community as well. Like we talked about, it's important that they're capable of not simply sympathizing, but they can actually empathize with the issues. And then from there, it's important to not only grow your community with the people that are affected, but it's also important to rope in as many allies as possible. The basic structure being that allies are there to provide references and recommendations and volunteer and in any way help a trans woman get a job. It's been really effective because we onboard somebody and then we train them in Python, then we train them in general software engineering practices, then we maybe do some full stack stuff. And then when they're ready, we start them on contributing to our open source software projects, and then they get a taste for contributing to free software. And then in combination, they're also building up their resume with those contributions, but then they go on. Once they've made enough contributions, they go on to make their own software project, which we help them start their first software project, free software project. And it's a proof is in the pudding scenario where you're like, oh, here's this person, just look what they're capable of, look at this project that they did, that's their code, those are PRs that they're choosing or declining, etc. And when you can show that to our allies, they jump on giving references. And when we show that, when we help these women build their resumes, they usually end up looking pretty impressive and going on to pretty nice careers.
So one thing that I'm really interested in, kind of as an anthropologist, is kinship. Kinship's a big thing in anthropology. Unfortunately, I couldn't draw a map because I just couldn't figure out a way to fit all those triangles in one small PowerPoint slide. Sorry, I use PowerPoint. It's a thing in academia. But can you talk a little bit about what a one-on-one lesson kind of looks like, how it's structured, what students can expect, what those who may choose to become mentors and teachers would expect?
So a student gets to choose their mentor and the appointment slot pretty easily. There's a page that I link them to, and there's a password. And then there's like Google Appointments and a mentor calendar, and you can read about the mentors that you choose. And then it's just one-on-one from there. And there's a general syllabus that we give to our teachers to help guide them. But the thing that we truly try to avoid is hard coding the syllabus, because people want flexibility. They don't want to we could just teach everyone, like full stack web dev on Python, but that's not what everyone's into. So we just say, here are some core concepts that are really important to cover that you're going to bump into wherever you choose to work. And then from there, it's up to the mentor to work with the student to develop a curriculum that's suited to their needs. So for example, let's say a chapter may be about databases or something, or some kind of data storage. The student could, if they're really into game programming, maybe they do something with SQLite, with like a game database, or maybe they want something simple and they write like a web application that's just a voting system, or so on and so forth. So it's just that they cover all these bases however they want. And if you've ever heard of, it's kind of like target-based learning. Yeah.
Yeah, so to go back to kinship in terms of the teaching and the students is, I imagine that as Hypatia gets off the ground, we'll in fact be able to chart who taught who, and then who did they teach, and then who did they teach, and then who did they teach. And it'll be a somewhat messy map because people obviously teach each other, and there's a lot of theory behind pedagogy. But it would be really neat one day to essentially be able to say, look at this great family of transcoders who aren't just teaching each other, but go on to teach the next generation of, well, us, people like me. Question?
forward. Hi. Hi. No, this is great. I have two questions. One is what types of relationships you might have with other organizations. Like I'm thinking of Trans Tech Social Enterprise and also TransHack. And then my second question is about, like, as you're talking about the different possible models you're exploring for creating work rather than only placing people with jobs, if you've also considered a worker cooperative as a possible, a worker-owned cooperative as a form or a structure that you might use.
Want the first one? 'Cause I have a quick answer to the first one.
Well, I'd like to say that one thing we do is we have what's basically a marketing entity for the freelance trans women developers in our organization, and we've been pretty successful at finding leads and like handing the contract off to them without taking any cut of the pay. So that's one thing we've tried, but we haven't really gone any further than that in that respect.
And to answer your first question about like Trans Tech Social and TransHack, well, I know the TransHack people, digitally at least, through Twitter. They actually have an excellent web series, Wednesday nights, 8:30. They did it all last month for Black History Month. It was probably some of the best. I'm sure they're archived somewhere online. You should all go and watch them. Some of the best talks I've ever heard in my life. But unfortunately, we haven't yet interfaced with them. I think part of it is we feel more nascent compared to them. And I think we still haven't really figured out the kind of racial intersection that we need to, especially for those two groups, to really kind of interface with them in a way that brings value both to them and to us. But hopefully we'll get there sooner rather than later. Did we catch everything here? Question? Sorry, we only have 2 mics, so.
Okay, so you've mentioned race twice now, and that a large portion of the trans feminine community that faces the brunt of violence is trans women of color. I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on how trying to get like a good engagement in demographics outside of white trans women. And what sorts of things that because you'd mentioned that was a weak area currently, or it sounded like that, and what sorts of strategies you were thinking of in improving in those areas.
Do you have an answer to that?
One of the things we've been working on is specifically seeking out what we call reluctant sex workers, people who would, and a lot of the time, these turn out to be women of color. One of the initial obstacles we had was establishing connectors to community leaders that were women of color. But we've been talking to a few people, and we have some pretty big plans, but that's for a later newsletter.
So I actually don't have any, it's a great question. Unfortunately, I don't have any good answers for how we move forward, but I can say that as I look through my data that I have on the collective through my work, race is either something that is absent to be talked about, whereas you can find plenty of examples of talking about, what it's like to start, different medications, what it's like to experience, passing for the first time out in public, and all these different issues, but race is just conspicuously absent. It's something that. It's not absent from discrimination. Correct, 100%. But it is absent from their discourse, and that's an important distinction. And that is why I've mentioned it is something that we're weak on and certainly need to improve on.
So I really love the idea of a student working with her mentor to decide areas that she's interested in developing her programming knowledge in. But if you, so I think it'd be a great goal to sustain that. If you shift to a more self-sustaining model, the B Corporation that you mentioned, do you think that will have to be adapted to respond to market pressures or anything like that? Or do you have something else in mind?
Right now, everything's oriented to making sure that they're becoming employed. But the way in which we teach them is through the things that they like to do. And surely, like, at some point, they're going to have to learn how to do, like, Python for the web application stuff. But you can always work at it from a certain perspective. And as long as they get core concepts that are trying to be illustrated, like we had one student that developed, like in a choose your own adventure kind of Flask application that was pretty neat. You know, and then there are other people who go from a more pragmatic approach and try to develop like service solutions, like someone made like a Twitter alternative and stuff like that.
All right, so we're going to talk a little bit, we've covered this slightly, but there's a little bit about the challenges that we face, you know, in doing this kind of work.
So one of the things I had to learn that was very difficult was that certain things that are really good for a lot of people in your organization as a safe space can also be very bad for other people of the same group. One of those things was in one of our safe spaces in like we have a transgender women only chat, and often sexual topics pop up, but we had some asexual members that brought up that it made them uncomfortable. So it's been like constantly adjusting and realigning some things, and like it used to be more of a problem, but through, again, iterating, we seem to find a really good intersectional approach. Another example is somebody said, oh, well, you say trans women only. What does that mean? So we had to establish an official rule, which is just people who self-identify as trans women, and it's as simple as that. So there's a lot of things that you just can't guess in theory, that you just have to work through an iteration.
You want to talk about leading by example, or?
Sure. One of the biggest things that I noticed was instead of instituting policies or making rules or enforcing stuff like bans or blah, 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 was just setting the tone for everyone to follow by leading by example. I noticed that if I made an effort to improve, if I made an effort to become more considerate, I saw a lot of others follow in the same respect. So being a role model in that sense, and in the sense of the mentors, and just the entire concept of role models for trans women or any group, is so essential for somebody to be able to like see that it's possible for them.
And I kind of covered, question. Sorry that everyone has to come down.
Hey there, thanks. Just a general question on what mentoring looks like in reality. Like, do you have an office where people come in and you're sitting next to them, or is it all like video conference? And so if that's true, have you ever met any of the students in real life? Like, have you become friends with them, or do you like meet IRL somehow?
So I, just by proxy of being executive director or president or whatever of the organization, I kind of constantly have to make it my life all the time. So like I annoy people plentifully enough that I do know people who mentor, but that's only because I do like face-to-face advertising about it. And I'm really active in I try to be active in local communities about these things, and pass out lots of cards in the meanwhile. But mostly we're online, and it's just video to video or audio to audio. The student gets to select what they want to do. Sometimes we just only do text, and that works best for them.
And I'm not a mentor. I'm just the one who's studying that. So I guess one of the big questions, especially one of the big questions that I hear a lot when talking about this stuff, is like, why not just have them join Debian Women or Arch Chicks or, you know, Outreachy or any of the other, you know, really good, you know, diversity, women in tech groups out there. And I think Lillian has a particularly helpful way of thinking about why we actually kind of need these groups that serve even smaller populi than just women in general, or, you know, people of color in general.
Oh, so I think I talked about this a little bit earlier about being able to sympathize versus empathize and role models. But another thing is that, much like diversity, being tolerant seems to just be not doing any, well, tolerance is often a least condition. Inclusion in a lot of spaces feels very least. And I say that because I've seen and heard a lot of stories about women in feminist organizations or otherwise who initially it was good and that it went on for a while, but when one day there was conflict, perhaps more transphobic sides of the community was revealed. And this is a repeating pattern where it's like, oh, of course you can join our community. We believe you're a woman and da-da-da-da-da. But then like, when something pops up where it may be like something about sexual harassment or something of the sort, it's really easy for abusive people in feminist spaces to just be the first voice heard to get people, transgender women, outed from those communities. And that's kind of the reality we face, is that people are like, well, oh, of course we're accepting. But then when it boils down to a situation where it actually matters, people seem to flake out or just be really aggressive about it. Oh, yeah, and as mentioned earlier, like a very specialized approach with somebody being able to sympathize with the challenges that you face as a transgender woman is monumental. Being able to have a role model that you can look up to that's like, oh yeah, you know, if you're having trouble getting your meds, maybe you should see a self-informed or informed consent clinic and da-da-da-da-da. And it sort of develops a very real relationship between the mentor and the student that goes beyond like, oh, I'm just here to get this thing done and then I'm gonna move on. And because again, it circles back to community.
Oh.
Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt you mid-sentence. Do you have any advice on how programs like Outreachy, which strive for radical inclusion, can do better to serve, I guess, shall we say, minority groups, be it identity minorities or racial minorities?
It quite simply boils down to representation. Are the people teaching them of the same community? Are they seeing their community represented in yours? And that's really like the role model effect is what I've seen to be the most distinguishing factor in our organization. So as long as you can develop role models that are professional resources it tackles a lot of issues at once for these people.
Hi, I was just wondering whether Hypatia has been able to pursue any type of grant or foundation funding to support its work.
We've been kind of struggling with filing as a nonprofit. We'd been looking into a B corporation. I've been wanting to go the nonprofit route because that would allow us to be a little bit more, for lack of a better word, discriminatory in our hiring process, to only go for transgender women, because that's a big part of the idea of the organization. So we'd really love to go nonprofit, especially since that's completely compatible with B corporation. Is very easy to switch over. But it's just an issue of money. There's not enough to go around. You know, when we get like $5,000 to take care of a lawyer to establish ourselves for X, Y, and Z, a million things will pop up, and maybe like one of our core developers experience something horrible, and we have to cover for these people because it's a community where people are in such impoverished situations where there are constantly emergencies occurring, like life or death situations. And I've been really bad about using money for establishing ourselves legally versus if somebody's coming to me and telling me they can't afford their meds because their insurance just like literally times it by 50. This has happened to me before with my medication because they don't see it as necessary, that there is somebody there to take care of them. And I feel like until we have a model that sustains itself in that right, I don't want to seek funding because it's all about developing a self-sustaining community where it's not all about just constantly seeking money just to dump in and solve people's problems. It's about developing real solutions to do that ourselves because it's about self-empowerment, although external money is always very useful. But so it's kind of that jumble of issues.
And so when I think about this question, and I interview the trans women that make up the collective, they use the word belonging a lot. They talk a lot about how this is a place where they belong. You know, they've gone to the Debian Women's, they've gone to the Arch Chicks, and for whatever reason, they just don't feel like they belong. And there's, you know, as Lillian pointed out, many reasons why one wouldn't belong. So I think that terminology is very useful in our thinking when it comes to these groups that serve, for lack of a better term, like smaller minority groups. Is the idea that these people are actually just looking for a place to belong.
Hi again. So we're talking about finding that kind of sustainable funding and also thinking about the kind of relationships that you're trying to build and talking about having this like, pedagogical lineage and expanding this outwards. Has it entered into your thinking about how to organize this that you might get like accredited and be, like run a 2-year institution and say like, we're going to give people associate's degrees and kind of like go more towards the traditional, or are you like set against that and you're saying we're going to, forge our own thing and we don't want to take, government education grants, we don't want our people taking out loans and so on?
Definitely and strongly the later. These are people who are very poor, so of course we wouldn't want it. As a community, it functions because volunteers care enough about the people that they're teaching to be there. And I feel for us to really function and serve our purpose, we can't be the former like you talked about. It has to be something that comes out of caring and a love for the community. Otherwise, we lose that community. Because if you just start hiring people based on their abilities in teaching in this particular professional setting, then you get more and more restrictions that force you to deviate farther from like actually fulfilling your mission. So we try to just keep it as simple as possible and iterate as much as possible, just like with our software.
And just to give you kind of a scope, the current curriculum as it's currently written is about a 6-month process. So there is actually, the space to actually do quite a bit of rigor in a 6-month training course. So I just want to talk a little bit about this kind of like idea of generative justice and how we can apply it to both what we do as free software people and also how the trans women in this collective have figured out how to use this model to help bring about their own liberation. So generative justice comes from Professor Dr. Ron Eglash at RPI. To give a big one-sentence overview of what generative justice is, it's the universal right to generate unalienated value and directly participate in its benefits, the rights of value generators to create their own conditions of production, and the rights of communities of value generation to nurture self-sustaining paths in its circulation. And if you want to see kind of more of our research into what generative justice is, we have a wiki for all that stuff. So this is kind of the model of flow when it comes to open source.
Can you just go over the term unalienated value?
Sure, absolutely. So for those of you who saw Luis's talk yesterday, he had a picture of Marx and said, "You've probably been accused of being that guy," which I loved. So this is a Marxist analysis of value flow. So let's say you work at a factory and you produce keys, because I can't think of anything else off the top of my head other than keys. When you make them, somebody else gets those profits. So the value of the key, you don't get to keep. The factory owner gets to keep. And then you get a little bit back in wages, but not really, the full value of that key. So if we look to Arduino, which is a free software hardware platform that I'm pretty sure most of you are familiar with. When you do free software, the software you write goes into a public commons. So no matter what anyone else does with it, you are never taken away from what you've done. You always have that software that you wrote at your disposal to do with, to change, whatever it might be, as you please. So you always retain full value of what you've done because you're always able to use it and keep on using it, keep on iterating it. So that's what we mean by unalienated. It's the fact that whatever value you've produced can't be taken away from you. And even, if Google or some other Microsoft, let's say, even if they use your code, that doesn't stop you from the value of your code. So that's kind of the difference between the two. So this is kind of the flow with the Arduino. The way you read it is you start at labor and you end at labor. That's kind of how the Marxist analysis works. But the point is, like I said before, is that everything we do goes into this public commons. So literally everything that we do is always available for us to use and reuse as you see fit. What I think is going on with the trans women is that they're kind of doing the same thing, but they're replacing tech with their social realities. So Hypatia becomes a place where they're able to work together to both go on this collective journey that they have of being trans, as well as all their own individual journeys. And they're able to talk about it, and they're able to kind of work through problems. And that is a form of labor. It's not free to just spend time helping other people, as we all know. But they also do open source. So I see this as an interesting model, how they can do both open source and their social experience and their social lives kind of at the same time. So this is a point where we kind of open it to the floor. Like I said at the beginning, I'll repeat one more time. If we just stand here and talk at you, you could easily walk away without a sense of owning this problem. So the point of having this, you know, half an hour or so of discussion time is to get you involved in this issue and get you involved to working towards solutions, you know, because all the words and all the talk really kind of doesn't mean anything unless we do something. So now would be a good time to start doing something. So I want to thank everyone now for listening to us, and I open the floor to any questions, comments, thoughts, anything you might have. Anyone, whichever one you're closest to.
So I really love everything you're doing right here. And the thing is, I myself am not a person of means, to say the least. I'm flat broke. But what I do have is a lot of like excess electronics, like maybe not the current generation stuff. And I think that this is the kind of thing that especially college students would be willing to just like love to donate to, especially at my school, at Cornell University. It has a huge LGBT community. People really support this. And I think that they would love to go on board and donate, especially electronics, because like a lot of people don't have money there either. So I was wondering, what are would you be accepting like drives for old computers or maybe like extra Raspberry Pis or iPads or things like that?
One of the issues that we come across is the time that it actually takes to ship things. If we provided a program like that, we need somebody specialized in handling that fulfillment and those resources and so on. I think that's a great idea though, but that we would want people to work with us so that like if they're like, oh, I have this thing to donate, we can act as a proxy to send it to certain people's addresses. Like there's tools you can use where somebody's like, oh, I want to buy this, but I don't want I shouldn't know the recipient's address. There's a few applications we use for that, but I'm not really involved with that too much. So there are ways to anonymously ship things, basically.
So I'm a teaching assistant in my home university, George Mason University. I know a lot of transgendered folk, but they're mainly of the trans men kind. Is Hypatia a organization I could refer them to, or do you guys only do trans women, or?
We try to be accepting toward everyone We try to be accepting toward everyone as our general attitude. Anyone's welcome to join and probably benefit from our resources, but that our outreach and our outreach and advertisements really focused on trans women because we're really equipped to prepare those issues. And we're more than willing to help anyone. It's just that we're so well prepared to help trans women.
Is there an organization that does deal more for trans men, or is that not an organization that's necessarily needed, or?
It's not, I can't say it's something I looked into, but I've heard people talk of.
Yeah, I would say, so Trans Hack would be the first thing I would think of to refer them to.
So you mentioned that you're not seeking grants, but do you have something like a Patreon that we can use to throw money at you? And if so, could you write that on the blackboard, or like a URL? And then the second one is do you work with organizations like Free Geek that are also approaches to try to hook up people who are of in like low-income situations with technology training and computing hardware?
I feel like we haven't gotten that far yet. Just to keep in mind, we've only been around for like 5 or 6 months. I feel like outreaching to other organizations is something that we want to do in the next quarter or the following. Yep. Yeah.
Thank you both for being here. This has been a really beautiful part of the program. I'm fairly new to free software, and as I've been hearing you talk about this work as being a source of liberation, I can see that obviously in the pragmatic sense of people being able to be employed and find gainful employment that way. But I'm wondering if there's something more philosophically in terms of free software, in terms of coding, in terms of having that means of control that you find has resonated with trans women in particular, and if you could speak on that a little bit.
Absolutely. One of the wonderful things that I've seen is that in a lot of other programs where people leverage free software to get people careers, there's not a high rate of those same people continuing to develop such. Like, it's just sort of okay, I gotta put something on my resume and then I don't really care. But from our community, by getting them involved in our projects and encouraging them to get involved in projects that they're interested in, including starting their own projects, we've had most of our students continue developing free software.
Hi, so I am a white cis male oppressor, and if I'm involved in a project that is a free software project that's full of such, full of white male cis oppressors, and it makes me kind of uncomfortable that that's the case. How can I help to try to expand the diversity of that when I and most of the people around, as you mentioned earlier, can sympathize perhaps, but are very bad at empathizing? What should I do?
So the first thing you can do is speak up about it. You know, I am, like you, a white, straight, cisgender man. And for the last 2 weeks, I flew half around the world to Tokyo to tell my home free software community that it's time to speak up and it's time to do something. And finally, after about a little more than a year of doing this and just repeating over and over again that, you know, it's time to end this culture of just the white men, they finally have started to listen. So I'm not going to say to you, it'll happen tomorrow. You know, go out and, you know, you'll achieve, you know, great victory. But that's a start. And it's the idea that it's not enough to say it one time. It's not enough to say it twice. It's not enough to say it 3 times. You have to just keep saying it. And you have to keep, in many ways, fighting through the people who will resist you. Because a lot of people, in my experience, will immediately put up a wall once you start to talk about these things. But the more you talk about it, the more you start to chip away at the wall. So one of the stories that I just have from that conference in Tokyo is a former member of the FreeBSD Foundation who said to me, you know, I didn't get these arguments at first, but then I kept hearing them, and at some point I was forced to think about them. And when I thought about them, I realized that I was in the wrong. So you can do it. You know, it is possible, but it kind of just takes persistence. And then, of course, it's a matter of bringing these people actually into the space and centering them in that space. And that, I will admit, at least from my experience, is much more difficult to do.
If you wanted to go out tomorrow and make a huge difference, you could go to our website and apply to mentor. You can also apply to help financially, or you could, there's a lot of ways to volunteer at our organization that you could do tomorrow.
Towards the beginning of this session, you sort of gave the elevator pitch for Hypatia, which is, you know, and probably is also similar to how you approach trans women. You say, we'll get you a job within 6 months or however long your curriculum is. And and as far as a transactional relationship goes, that's perfectly fine. You know, that's wonderful. You know, you go and you know, you get a great benefit out of it and so forth. And that's sort of one core value that Hypatia is providing. But I was wondering about what your vision is and maybe current practice for the ongoing relationship that former students have after they reach after they succeed in reaching this goal.
A lot of our developers continue working with us on our open source projects or go on to mentor other students or just stay around to help or just stay around to be a part of the community. So we seem to be doing really good at retainment, I think. In terms of long-term plans, we've been trying to set it up so we can better track statistics. We've developed some key performance indicators. One of them is job retainment. You know, we're getting people a job, but are they going to have it a year after? Are they going to be in the same field 5 years after? That sort of thing. So I feel like we're doing little approaches for that, but we're not quite there yet to do anything more than that, if that makes, at the moment.
Hi. One question ago, we were talking about the concept of out in the general community, you should speak up when you see things that are wrong, bad behavior, bad attributes of a project. That thread of discussion kind of assumes that everybody knows how to recognize the bad behavior or bad attributes. Can you give us some kind of a sketch of, like, you know, for somebody who is new to thinking about these issues and not well versed and not well practiced, what's a trigger for me to see, like, oh, that's something that I really need to jump in there and try to correct it in a nice way?
The best way to do it is to just have a friend that's a trans woman, or at least be involved with those people. The second best thing you can do is just to read about stuff like microaggressions you can make against trans women, like if somebody applies to some company and they include their picture and they're a trans woman, and you say, oh, I would have never guessed you're a trans woman, like, it's important for other people to call out, like, hey, what the heck does that mean?
Hi, I'm one of the coordinators of Outreachy, and we are expressly welcoming of trans women and trans men, and we've also opened the program to people of color in the United States who are underrepresented in technology, in addition to having been open to women internationally for 5 years, including trans women. And yeah, I just wanted to, you know, share flyers with you, and you know, of course, I'd be happy to compare notes later about basically bootstrapping into this distributed mentoring model that's remote. That's pretty much what we're doing as well. And I totally appreciate what you said about how you are more specialized to help a group of people who have more of shared concerns and shared understanding. And at the same time, it's this kind of mentorship model is a great way to help to get allies who can be mentors, because being in a free software community where most people are white men or are cis women, or, you know, like the larger groups being those populations, I feel like you know, that's one of the ways people can help as mentors. So I you know, would be happy to have people who go through your program apply for Outreachy. And for people here, like I have a ton of Outreachy flyers and also Google Summer of Code flyers, and I'd be happy to talk to people about those programs. So it's more of a comment and sympathy.
Yeah, we should we could talk after the program.
Yeah,
would be good.
So it's about 4:30. I think we wrap up, what, 15 minutes or so? Yeah. Does anyone have anything else to contribute, to talk about?
So just out of curiosity, have y'all considered directly engaging with existing free software projects that may be lacking and begging for help? And, you know, just going with that.
Oh yeah, totally. That's pretty high up on the list. The reason that we're currently focused on our own software products right now is because just the community that's based around it, and we feel once people are more prepared, like later in the mentoring process, that we'll just have them go into the general free software community and make contributions that way. But again, like they're also making their own free software projects, which is cool.
Right. But I will say that this collective, just through historical happenstance, happens to have connections to the FreeBSD Foundation, the FreeBSD project, who are one of those groups who are now finally saying, yes, you know, help us, like, let's make this a reality.
Yeah, we're a bunch of FreeBSD devs.
Yeah, if that's it, then thank you, everybody.